He had money. He had food. He was just 5 miles from the nearest highway, but he still starved to death in a yellow tent deep in the Florida swamps. A man was found curled up like he was sleeping. No signs of foul play. No one searching for him. For 3 months, his body lay there, quietly fading, under the scorching sun of Big Cypress. His name? No one knew. Where was his family? No one ever called. But what made it even more baffling, he had chosen this journey, chosen to disappear. And when they found him, the first thing they noticed was the pair of shoes neatly placed outside the tent, as if he were still alive, just taking a nap. He first appeared in the spring of 2017 along the Appalachian Trail, one of the longest trekking routes in the United States, stretching from Georgia to Maine. A man with no name, no ID, no phone, no credit cards. When people asked who he was, he simply smiled and said, "Mostly harmless." That was it. No explanation. No need to know more. That's the name people started calling him, not because he insisted on it, but because it fit strangely well. A man who meant no harm, bothered no one, and simply walked alone through the deepest forests of the eastern U.S., and those who met him, even just once, never forgot him. A woman named Kelly Fairbanks, a trail angel known for helping hikers along the route, once pulled over when she saw him strolling along Highway 90 in northern Florida. The first thing she noticed was his long, scruffy beard and those strangely bright eyes. But what made her stop wasn't his appearance. It was the way he held his trekking poles. Steady, efficient, like someone who had done this for a long time. They chatted for a few minutes. When she asked what app he used to track his route, he gave a gentle smile and said, "I don't have a phone." Kelly snapped a few photos to remember the moment. At the time, she had no idea. She had just captured the face of a man who would become one of America's greatest mysteries. Mostly, Harmless never tried to stand out. But it was that quiet presence that made him unforgettable to so many. A 66-year-old woman named Obsidian once hiked nearly 100 miles with him in Virginia. She said he loved listening to stories but rarely talked. He was always the first to build a fire, went to bed early, rose early, and always left the campsite. Spotless. One evening, while they sat by the fire, she asked, "Where are you headed?" He replied, "To Key West. I want to see the blue ocean at the end of the world." She laughed, thinking he was joking, but he wasn't. What drew people to him was the gentleness in the way he interacted. He didn't gossip. He didn't complain. At a resupply station called Mountain Crossings in Georgia, an employee named Matt Mason recalled, "I saw him open his wallet and pull out a roll of cash, the size of a fist. And all he asked for was a paper map. No Google, no phone." In an era where everyone lives on social media, a man walking thousands of miles with just a paper map felt like something out of a fairy tale. But Matt added, what struck him most wasn't that this guy lived off the grid. It was that he was kind. When people offered help, mostly Harmless never asked for more. He took only what he needed and always said thank you, with a sincerity you couldn't fake. No matter how far he walked, he never left anything behind except good memories. Some people remember he loved ketchup, once carrying a big bottle with him down the trail. Another time, someone saw him eating a sticky bun with both hands like a kid, his eyes lighting up like he'd just discovered the greatest thing in the world. He often camped in quiet, offbeat spots near streams, where the light was soft and the ground gentle, as if he wasn't just walking, but learning how to live, slowly, in sync with nature. But here's the strange part. The longer he walked, the less he shared about himself. At first, he mentioned working in tech and said he had a sister in Sarasota. But later, when people asked more, he'd change the subject. No one knew where he was really from. Some thought he came from Baton Rouge, but when asked directly, he would just smile. The one thing he always carried, a notebook filled with complex code for an online game called Screeps. But one really understood it, but they remembered it. A man escaping the digital world, yet carrying with him the last trace of his old virtual life. And so he walked on, No one knew his real destination. No one dared ask why he had left everything behind. But everyone sensed it. He wasn't walking to be seen. He was walking to heal, as if each step took him further from a past he never spoke about. In April 2018, mostly Harmless was seen for the last time at an unnamed spot near the southwestern edge of Big Cypress Preserve, Florida. He was spotted by a couple hiking southbound. They recalled that he looked thinner than in earlier photos, but he was still walking strong, still smiling. As he spoke, "I'm heading to Key West," he told them. For many who had heard that line before, it didn't mean much. But to this couple, it sounded like a goodbye. After that, no one saw him again. No new traces, no messages, and no one ever reported him missing. Florida in the summer is brutal for anyone, even seasoned hikers. The air feels thick like tar. Clouds of mosquitoes hang in the air. There are venomous snakes, alligators, and dark sucking swamps that can swallow a person whole in seconds. And mostly Harmless, once a tech worker, may never have faced such a harsh environment. Still, he ventured into Big Cypress, a wilderness stretching over 720,000 acres, marked only by faint trails and lacking any official support stations. No one knows exactly what happened next. Maybe he got lost. Maybe he collapsed from exhaustion, dehydration, or illness deep in the swamp. But what haunted everyone was this. When the truth finally came out, it came without answers. On July 23rd, 2018, exactly 3 months after his last sighting, two hikers stumbled upon his tent at an informal campsite, known as Noble's Camp, more than 10 miles from the nearest road. They were exhausted after hours of slogging through the swamp in nearly 100-degree heat, their legs aching from slipping over wet, unstable ground. When they saw the small yellow tent in a clearing, they breathed a sigh of relief, hoping for water or a place to rest. Everything looked normal at first. The tent was pitched neatly. His shoes were lined up outside the entrance. No sign of disorder. But as they got closer, something felt off. The stench was overwhelming, and the air around the camp felt unnaturally heavy. They called out, no response. When they gently pulled back the mesh flap, they saw a man curled up as if asleep. Only this sleep would never end. He was dead, had been for a long time. His body was skin and bones, so emaciated it looked like he had been starving for weeks. One of them, trembling, called 911. His voice wavered, swallowed by the buzzing of insects and the swamp's heavy breath. We just found a dead body." No one could have guessed that the lifeless figure lying there had once walked nearly 2,000 miles, that he was the same man remembered by dozens of strangers, the man who had chosen the name Mostly Harmless, and then, quite literally, vanished. Collier County deputies arrived quickly. They found no ID, no phone, nothing to identify him. But they did find something that made the case even stranger: over $3,500 in cash tucked into a bag. Some unopened packets of food still inside his own backpack, and most notably, a notebook filled with lines of code for a strange online game called Screeps. Everything in the tent was orderly. No signs of struggle, no signs of violence. The autopsy only deepened the mystery. No toxins in his system, no evidence of suicide, no wounds, just death by exhaustion. But why? He had the money to buy food. He had water in his pack. He was only 5 miles from a main road. He could have called for help if he wanted to, but he didn't. No one could understand. Even more unsettling, no one had reported anyone missing who matched his description. His fingerprints didn't match any database. His face didn't appear in any national missing persons report. It was as if he had never existed. A man in the age of surveillance, data, and digital footprints had died completely anonymous, completely forgotten. But then something happened. His photo began to spread on social media, and those who had met him, those who remembered him, recognized that familiar face. The story began to ripple outward in sharp contrast to the quiet way he had died. And from there, a new journey began. The search for the Hopon Pau. true name of the man no one had been looking for. When a composite sketch of the man's face was released, no one expected it to spark such a powerful wave of recognition. The first to identify him was Kelly Fairbanks, the trail angel who had once spoken with him along Highway 90. The moment she saw those familiar eyes and that distinctive beard, Kelly froze. She dug through her phone, found the photo she had taken nearly a year earlier, and sent it straight to the Collier County Sheriff's Office. And she wasn't alone. Over the next few days, dozens more came forward. An elderly woman from Virginia, a store clerk in Georgia, a couple who had camped with him in Maryland. Each brought a memory. None knew his name. A picture began to form, but it was fragmented. One person remembered him saying he was from Baton Rouge. Another swore he had said New York. At times, he mentioned a sister named Sarah in Sarasota. Other times, he said Saratoga. None of the details directly contradicted each other, but they were hazy, slippery. The more people searched, the more tangled it became. Someone recalled him saying he used to work in tech. Another thought he seemed strangely clueless when using a compass, as if he had only recently learned how to survive in the wild. It gave people a strange feeling, not that he was hiding something, but that he was slowly erasing himself. Like a man tearing up pages of his own story and scattering them to the wind. Online, a grassroots network began to form, calling themselves the Mostly Harmless community, made up of people who had met him, cared about him, or were simply haunted by the question, who was he? They gathered data, compared photos, mapped out his route, and analyzed the handwriting in the notebook found in his pack. One detail left everyone baffled. That notebook was filled with dense programming code for a niche online game designed for elite developers called Screeps. So why would a man who had rejected technology be carrying a symbol of the digital world in his backpack? Some speculated he was a former software engineer. Others thought he might have left tech behind after a breakdown. A few floated wilder theories. Maybe he was a hacker in hiding, a whistleblower, or someone fleeing a lawsuit. But no one had proof. Just a feeling, pieced together from his handwriting, his language, his camping habits, his taste in food. A few recognized a coding pattern, similar to one used by a small group of developers in Louisiana. But still, no name, no match. And then, the question that began to gnaw at everyone. If so many people saw him, remembered him, cared about him, why didn't anyone report him missing? Where was his family? Who were his friends? Where had he worked? Paid taxes? Gone to school? Here was a man with tech knowledge who seemed to have had a professional life, yet left no trace in any formal system. It felt like he hadn't just left the world behind. The world had let go of him long ago. That's when a new figure stepped into the story. Natasha Teasley, a boat rental operator in North Carolina who once saw him walking by the riverbank. I don't know why I can't let go of this story, she said. Every night I find myself scrolling through missing persons lists, searching every face. Natasha didn't know him, but she felt like she owed him something. Maybe it was his eyes, soft but silently pleading to be seen. Natasha, along with others in the Mostly Harmless community, did what law enforcement hadn't. They raised money to uncover the man's identity. In just 8 days, they raised over $5,000, enough to send a bone sample to a DNA lab in Texas. And thanks to advanced genetic testing, they found a distant match to a family line in Assumption Parish, Louisiana. The surname Rodriguez began to surface. Tiny clues started to fall into place, but still no confirmation. Here was a man who had brushed past so many lives, now at the center of a mystery with no crime, no suspect, just questions. And then, in late 2020, a woman named Marie unexpectedly contacted the Collier County Sheriff's Office. She said, "I know who that man is. I loved him once. I recognize that scar. I recognize that handwriting. I'm sure of it." The story was about to turn a page into a new chapter filled with names, pasts, and shadows no one had anticipated. His name was Vance John Rodriguez. Born in February 1976 near Baton Rouge, Louisiana. The person who confirmed it was Marie, his former girlfriend, who had once lived with him in Brooklyn, shortly before he disappeared from everything. When she saw the snippets of code from his notebook, shared online, Marie froze. Not just because the handwriting looked familiar, but because of the way the code was written, the structure, the syntax, the small, repeated mistakes. It was Vance's coding style. Odd, distinct, unmistakably his. Then she saw the scar beneath his stomach, a crescent shape stretching from his navel to his side, left by a no incident when he was 15, and she knew it was him. It couldn't be anyone else. When Marie reached out to the authorities, she didn't say much. She sent a few old photos, a handwritten letter Vance had once given her, and a printed copy of code he'd written with a simple note. He used to write exactly like this. Forensics quickly compared the DNA from mostly Harmless's bones with Vance's old medical records, and it was a perfect match. After more than 2 years, the identity of the nameless man was confirmed. But instead of relief, many in the community who had searched so hard for him were left with a quiet, aching sadness. The truth wasn't what they'd hoped. Vance had once been a gifted boy, brilliant at math, obsessed with computers from a young age, but he was also deeply introverted, withdrawn. The Rodriguez family, like most families, had its flaws, but for Vance, those cracks seemed to cut deeper. At 15, in a moment of despair, he shot himself in the stomach in a field near Baton Rouge. As the blood poured out, he raised his hand to flag down a passing truck. He survived, but he was never quite the same again. The scar was real, and so was the trauma. After recovering, Vance grew increasingly isolated. He was smart enough to earn a college scholarship, eventually landing a job in tech. But his personal life followed a familiar cycle. Connection, then withdrawal, intimacy, then disappearance. People who had worked with him described him as brilliant, but at times unstable. Marie, who had once loved him deeply, remembered him as someone who could be incredibly gentle, and then suddenly distant, cold, even angry, without warning. She didn't deny that their relationship had hurt her, but when she learned that he had died alone in the woods with enough food, money, and water to survive, she couldn't ignore it, because part of her knew this was his greatest fear, and somehow also what he had chosen. As the truth about Mostly Harmless's identity spread, hundreds of people who had followed his story felt disoriented. Many had imagined him as a pure soul, a nameless man, abandoned by the world. But now they learned he had hurt people. He wasn't only a victim. He had caused pain too, and that made things harder to accept. The story was no longer black and white. It had become gray, messy, real, like life always is. Some felt disappointed. Others understood this was why they had been drawn to the story in the first place. Because everyone has shadows. Everyone, at some point, becomes someone others can't understand. And sometimes, what makes a person invisible isn't that the world forgets them, but that they've learned how to disappear from it. Vance Rodriguez, the man once known as Mostly Harmless, wasn't a hero. He wasn't a villain. He wasn't even a tragedy. He was a person carrying wounds too deep to be healed with words. And maybe, just maybe, those 15 months of walking through wilderness, that long, quiet journey, was the only way he could find even a flicker of peace, however, brief, that he had never known in life. When the identity of Mostly Harmless, Vance Rodriguez, was confirmed, the first thing the community felt wasn't relief. It was heartbreak. Many had built up an image of him, a kind, gentle man who had left behind the chaos of the world to live, simply closer to nature, a symbol of peace and minimalism in a noisy age. But now they had to face the truth. Vance had once been accused of being controlling in relationships. He had hurt people. He had a complicated psychological past. He had attempted suicide. He had lived in cycles of isolation and detachment. And another deeper truth was coming into focus. Maybe he chose to die. Not because he was lost. Not because he ran out of supplies. But because he didn't want to return. Inside the yellow tent where he passed away, police found his shoes neatly placed by the entrance, his backpack tucked against the wall, and a full bottle of water beside him. His body was lying on its side, arms wrapped gently around his stomach, like someone trying to find a peaceful position for one final sleep. Investigators noted no signs of struggle, no signs of distress. The ground outside was undisturbed. Everything was quiet, ordered, almost eerily so. He hadn't died in fear. He died like someone who was ready. And that was the biggest shift of all. His death, once seen as a mysterious disappearance, now looked like a conscious choice. That realization left many who had followed his story feeling lost. Natasha Teasley, who had spent hundreds of hours helping identify Vance, admitted, "I had hoped that finding his name would help bring him back to his family, bring him some dignity. But it turns out maybe he didn't want that." A quiet crisis of conscience rippled through those who had cared so much. Had they intruded on something he'd deliberately left behind? Had they dragged someone into the light who had only ever wanted to live in the dark? Some began to question the blurry line between helping and overstepping. Kindness can become pressure when the person receiving it no longer wants it. And maybe what made Mostly Harmless so compelling wasn't who he was, but that he had chosen not to be anyone at all. He had let go of identity, cast off connections, and created a simplified version of himself just to find peace. Yet the kindness of strangers still found its way to him, even though he never asked for it. That, too, was both beautiful and deeply sad. And so, people began to look inward, not to judge Vance, but to reflect on the cracks within our society. A modern world where a person can disappear completely for years and no one notices. No one files a report. No family member comes looking. Vance had siblings. He'd had girlfriends. He'd worked. And yet, in the end, no one truly held on to him. His story became a mirror, revealing the gaps that no system can fully close, how mental health is overlooked, how depression is misunderstood, and how the quietest souls are often the easiest to miss. The Mostly Harmless community, once driven to name Janyavo body, now became a group learning to sit with silence. They stopped trying to explain why Vance died. They stopped asking why he didn't reach out for help. They began to understand some choices, no matter how painful, deserve respect. Vance's death, then, is not just a bizarre true crime case. It is a quiet lesson in loneliness, in autonomy, and in the human right to leave without needing to explain why. The yellow tent where Vance Rodriguez spent his final moments has long since been cleared from Big Cypress. The makeshift camp is gone. The stench has faded. But something still lingers in the wind that rustles, the grass and the early morning mist that clings to the ground. Some say they've gone back there just to stand for a few minutes, not out of curiosity, but because they felt like they owed him something, maybe an apology, maybe just the simple acknowledgement that he existed, that he once walked this world with real feet and a wounded heart. No one was arrested for Vance's death. No one was investigated for leaving him behind. No charges, no restitution, but no one forgot either. And somehow, that made it all feel heavier than any courtroom verdict. Because the stories that leave no one to blame often leave the deepest scars. There was no one to point fingers at, no one to forgive, only a quiet emptiness, forcing each of us to ask, if I had passed Vance on the street, would I have known he needed help? Would I have stopped like Kelly did? Or would I have walked right past him like we all do with the invisible? In the end, Vance's death wasn't about the body. It was about the soul, the part of him that had wanted to disappear long ago. That 15-month walk was a slow farewell. Maybe he'd been dying in pieces all along, ever since people stopped asking how he was, ever since no one truly listened to the answers. And when the world finally learned his name, what they faced wasn't a crime. It was a society that had no place for the quiet ones. The Mostly Harmless community. Those strangers who once raised funds, searched databases, and hoped to bring him back to his family, have since shifted to a new mission. They founded the Kindness Project, a volunteer group devoted to identifying other unnamed souls across America. They say if Vance once called out into the night and no one answered, at least now we will. To them, knowing a person's name isn't about closure. It's about beginning a new kind of conversation, about memory, about dignity, and about how we treat those who don't fit the mold. And so, the story of Vance Rodriguez, told through thousands of comments, tweets, TikToks, and podcasts, has become a shared memory. A man who wanted to vanish completely is now remembered by millions. A man who left behind nothing but a pair of neatly placed shoes, a worn tent, and a few pages of code has become a symbol of a question we must all ask ourselves. How do we keep from becoming invisible in our own lives? This story has no ending, no destination, but maybe that was never the point. Maybe what matters isn't where we're going, but who will remember us when we're gone. And if you've made it this far into the story, please remember there was once a man named Vance. He once called himself mostly harmless. He walked into the wilderness not to disturb anyone. And yet, in the end, he made the whole world stop, go silent. And listen, maybe you are hearing this on a quiet night in a room with just the soft whirl of a fan or the distant sound of traffic. Maybe you're thinking of someone, a friend you lost touch with, a silent family member, or even yourself, someone who once just wanted to disappear. If so, you're not alone. Thousands of people followed Vance's journey without knowing his name. They felt something deeply human in his eyes, and that was enough. Enough to care, enough to act, enough to remember his name in a world that moves far too fast. So if you see yourself somewhere in this story, in the shoes outside a lonely tent, in the knowing but quiet eyes, just leave a comment. Me too. No explanation needed. No reasons why. Just so we all know someone out there is still listening, still understanding, still here. And if you want to keep walking with us through stories that haven't yet found their ending, stories of people time nearly forgot, follow this page, not because we need more followers, but because every follow is a quiet promise. We will not forget those who were once forgotten. Because sometimes the only way to live forever is to be remembered, with a name, with memory, with all the respect a person deserves, even if they chose to live quietly or leave without a word.